This is your slide lecture summary for Part 5b. In addition to the programmatic genres, Romantic era composers continued to write in the multi-movement absolute genres of the classical era. This included the symphony, concerto, and chamber music, such as string quartet, quintet, or piano trio. The symphony became the highest form of absolute music beginning in the classical era. It continued to develop in the Romantic era, moving from the palace to the public concert hall. Although the form of the symphony continued to follow the classical multi-movement cycle, the orchestra was greatly increased in size and instrumentation, and the symphonies themselves were longer with lyrical themes and new, more colorful harmonies. In the Romantic era, the usual number and tempo of the movements was not always followed. Sometimes a symphony might have 5 movements or end with a slow movement, such as works by Beethoven and Tchaikovsky. Johannes Brahms was a talented German composer from a musical family. He became close friends with Robert and Clara Schumann, who helped to launch his successful career as a composer. He ultimately settled in Vienna and died at the age of 64 of cancer. Brahms was a traditionalist, breathing new life into old forms. His output consisted of 4 symphonies, solo piano works, lieder and chamber music, and often exhibited classical and romantic traits, as in his 3rd Symphony. Brahms wrote his 3rd Symphony in 1883 when he was 50 years old. It is the shortest of his 4 symphonies, romantic in tone, though classical in structure. It follows the structure of 18th century form, but is cyclical. That is, themes or sections tend to return in part or as whole, or in variation in subsequent movements. Listen for a lyrical melancholic melody with a waltz-like feeling and arched regular phrases. The meter is triple at a moderate tempo. The rhythm patterns are complex with 3/2 patterns and syncopation. The key alternates from minor to major and back to minor, with a chromatic middle section. The movement is in a 3-part structure, with arched dynamics and subtle rubato. Woodwinds are featured in the middle section, and French horns bring the return of the A section. Opera was one of the most important and best-loved theatrical genres of the 19th century. It served to foster different national styles in 3 European countries, Italy, Germany, and France. Opera allowed women musicians visibility. Not many women composed opera, but the women opera singers were among the most prominent performers of their day. Jenny Lind was known as the Swedish Nightingale. Maria Malibran, the daughter of celebrated tenor Manuel Garcia, had her singing career cut short due to a riding accident. However, her younger sister Pauline Viardot was able to achieve success in the performance of the premieres of vocal works by Brahms, Schumann, and Berlioz. In the 19th century, the opposing genres of serious opera and comic opera were still prevalent in Italy. Important composers of opera in this era were the Italian composers, Gioacchino Rossini, who wrote The Barber of Seville and William Tell, and Giuseppe Verdi, who sought to develop a national style in his operas, such as Rigoletto and La Traviata. Giuseppe Verdi was an Italian composer and is best known for his 28 operas. He studied music in Milan and married his benefactor's daughter. He suffered the tragic loss of his 2 children and his wife in 1839. Verdi was unhappy living under Austrian Habsburg rule. His works were interpreted as patriotic for the nationalist cause of Italy. He composed successful operas until he was nearly 80 years old. Verdi died at 87, revered as a national hero. Verdi strove to communicate dramatic situations with profound emotion in his operas. Verdi's career may be divided into 3 compositional periods. Early period operas include Macbeth, Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, and La Traviata. The middle period was A Masked Ball, The Force of Destiny, and Don Carlos. And his final period was Aida and the Shakespeare operas Othello and Falstaff. A play by Victor Hugo, The King is Amused, which was banned in France, served as Verdi's inspiration for Rigoletto. The librettist was Francesco Piave. Rigoletto is an opera in 3 acts set in Renaissance Mantua. It tells a tale of seduction and deceit with a tragic end. One of the most popular operatic moments is the tenor aria La Donna Mobile, Woman is Fickle, from Act 3, followed by the quartet Un dì. In the tenor aria, listen for a soaring tenor line with accented notes and a lilting triple meter with some rubato. The form is strophic, framed by an orchestral ritornello that serves to unify the aria. The musical expression is a result of stirring music with broadly contrasting dynamics. In the quartet, listen for a dialogue between the characters, then a simpler square melody. The tempo is allegro, with agitated movement in the rhythmic figures. Each of the 4 characters, Duke, Maddalena, Gilda, and Rigoletto, is able to reveal his or her emotion. Germany did not have the operatic tradition of Italy and France. The predecessor of the German opera was the Singspiel, a light or comic drama with spoken dialogue. Richard Wagner was the German composer who created the genre of music drama, which was a perception of opera as a total artwork, Gesamtkunstwerk, unifying all elements of music, poetry, drama, and visual spectacle. Wagner began his musical career in Dresden. After a revolution he sympathized with failed in 1849, he went into exile to Switzerland, where he brought forth his theories about music drama. King Ludwig II was an ardent admirer of Wagner and summoned him back to Germany. A theater, which became known as the Festival Theater at Bayreuth, was planned specifically for the presentation of Wagner's music dramas. He eventually married Cosima Liszt, daughter of Franz Liszt. His last work, Parsifal, was composed at the age of 70. He died shortly thereafter and was buried at Bayreuth. Music drama was a perception of opera as total artwork, unifying all elements of music, poetry, drama, and visual spectacle. This was often achieved through the use of leitmotifs, or leading motives, which are themes which recur throughout a work and represent a person, emotion, idea, or object in the drama. Changes in the characters and their situations were reflected in the transformation of the themes that represented them. Wagner used chromatic dissonance freely to convey an intense emotional quality, often portraying states of the soul. The Ring of the Nibelung is a cycle of 4 music dramas written by Wagner, who based the libretto on a combination of Nordic legend and inspiration from a medieval German epic poem. The cycle consists of Das Rheingold, Die Walküre, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. The cycle begins when a dwarf named Albrecht steals the gold of the Rhine River, which was guarded by the Rhine maidens. He fashions a ring from that gold that will bring unlimited power to its owner. Wotan, father of the gods, obtains the ring, and Albrecht announces a terrible curse that would destroy the peace of mind of all who gain possession of it. Die Walküre is the 2nd music drama of the Ring of the Nibelung. The plot of Die Walküre revolves around a twin brother and sister, Siegmund and Sieglinde, who are offspring of Wotan and a mortal. The Valkyries are the 9 daughters of Wotan, whose task is to circle the battlefield on their winged horses to gather up the fallen heroes and bring them to Valhalla. Act 3 begins with the famous Ride of the Valkyries, an orchestral depiction of these 9 warrior maidens on their way from the battlefield carrying fallen heroes slung across the saddles of their winged horses. Listen for a swirling melodic figure in the strings and woodwinds, then the famous Ride leitmotif that ascends and repeats many times. Battle cries ensue from soloists in call and response format. The melody is continual with lively dotted rhythms in 9/8. The leitmotif is heard in both minor and major tonalities. The texture is polyphonic, combining the main theme and the swirling melodic ideas. The excited mood is accomplished through huge dynamic contrasts and the battle cries of the flying warriors. The large orchestra is a variety of brass and woodwind instruments, a large percussion section, string players, and 6 harps. Exoticism is a musical style in which rhythms, melodies, and instruments evoke the color and atmosphere of far-off lands. This ideal easily found an outlet in opera, which could be set anywhere in the world. In the Romantic era, many such operas were produced and became popular. Among these were Aida by Verdi, which was an Italian opera set in Egypt, Turandot and Madame Butterfly by Puccini, which were set in Asia, and Carmen by Bizet, which was a French opera set in Spain. In the late 19th century, composers chose different paths with regard to musical expression. Some chose a traditional course, retaining the language of the late Romantic era, and others went in entirely new directions. Ballet has been present in the European culture since the Renaissance, where it was a central theatrical entertainment associated with weddings and similar celebrations. Although ballet often appeared as a feature in opera, it rose in prominence as an independent art form in the 18th century. Choreographer Sergei Diaghilev and his troupe Ballet Russe, based in Paris, surrounded himself with great dancers such as Nijinsky and Kazavina, and productions that were worthy of their talents. He invited artists such as Picasso and Braque to paint the sets. Diaghilev also commissioned the 3 ballets that brought Igor Stravinsky to fame: The Firebird, Petrushka, and Rite of Spring. Peter Tchaikovsky was a composer who typified the mood of the late 19th century, as he expressed the pessimism that had engulfed the late Romantic movement. Tchaikovsky was a Russian composer who left his career in law for music. He struggled with sexual identity, resulting in a disastrous marriage to a student, Antonia Milyukova. His musical career was subsidized for a time by patron Nadezhda von Meck, with the stipulation that she and Tchaikovsky were never to meet. Tchaikovsky was invited to participate in the opening ceremonies of Carnegie Hall in New York in 1891. He died suddenly at the age of 53, possibly having contracted cholera from tainted water. Tchaikovsky had an effect for the ballet. He wrote 3 ballets that were very quick to become standard works of the Russian repertory: Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker. The Nutcracker was based on a tale by E.T.A. Hoffmann and an expanded version by Alexandre Dumas. The action of the ballet centers around a young girl named Clara and her gift of a nutcracker at Christmas. In Dance of the Sugarplum Fairy, listen for a staccato melody that is somewhat chromatic in a bouncy duple meter. The dance is in a 3-part form, and the instrumentation features the use of the bell-like timbre of the celesta, accompanied by a bass clarinet and pizzicato strings. In Tripak, listen for short staccato note melodies, descending with sforzando accents. The feel is that of a lively peasant dance, and the tempo employs an accelerando. The music is primarily homophonic, with the appearance of a contrapuntal texture in the B section. It is in 3-part form, with a vivacious mood building to a frenzy at the end. The featured instruments are tambourine, strings, woodwinds, and trumpets in a fanfare. Toward the end of the 19th century, composers began to take several divergent paths. Among these were Impressionism, which was embraced by French composers Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel, and Post-Romanticism, which was highly influenced by Wagner and championed by opera composer Giacomo Puccini, among others. Giacomo Puccini was a main voice of a group of opera composers associated with a movement known as Verismo, or realism. The advocates of this trend strived to bring in subjects from everyday life and treat them in a down-to-earth fashion. The most famous operas of this tradition were La Bohème by Puccini, I Pagliacci by Leoncavallo, and Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni. Giacomo Puccini was an Italian opera composer who wrote in the Verismo style. His early operatic successes included Manon Lescaut, La Bohème, Tosca, and Madame Butterfly. His last work, Turandot, which was based on a Chinese fairy tale, was left unfinished because he was sick with cancer. Puccini died in 1924 of a heart attack resulting from complications from the cancer treatment. Madame Butterfly is a combination of Verismo and exoticism. The opera was inspired by a performance of a play by the same name. The plot is centered on a tragic heroic character who is a geisha named Chiyo-Chiyo-san, meaning butterfly, who agrees to an arranged marriage to an American naval officer. After the marriage, he departs shortly thereafter. In the famous aria from Act II, Chiyo-Chiyo-san sings Belle Dee, which describes her desire for her lover's return. Listen for a soaring melodic line alternating with a speech-like section reaching several climaxes. The rhythm is slow and dreamy and becomes more agitated rhythmically. The harmony consists of both rich accompaniment and unison writing. The mood is dreamlike, passionate, and emotional, which is conveyed by rising dynamic lines. The opening is sparsely accompanied by a solo violin. In the 1860s, Impressionist painters broke with the grandiosity of contemporary art. They tried to capture the freshness of first impressions and the continuous change in the appearance of their subjects. Prominent Impressionist painters include Monet, Degas, and Renoir. The term Impressionist was originally one of derision, referencing Monet's Impression Sunrising. In a parallel development, symbolist poets sought to evoke images through suggestion rather than description. Their aim was symbol rather than statement, achieving an abstraction of language. Prominent symbolist poets were Mallarmé and Verlaine, both strongly influenced by the American Edgar Allan Poe. Some later 19th century French composers were inspired by the Impressionist and Symbolist movements and sought a similar ambiguity in sound. These composers experimented with subtlety and ambiguity. For them, the major-minor system had become too predictable. They replaced that system with dissonance and subtle harmonic relationships instead. Central to the style was the use of chromaticism, whole-tone muted sounds. The 1889 World's Exhibition in Paris highlighted technological achievements such as Edison's phonograph and the Eiffel Tower, built especially for the event. But the fair was also political and imperialist, showcasing France's far-reaching colonies and their cultures, which stretched to North and West Africa, the Middle East, and Indochina. This was all part of the larger spread of nationalism in the 19th century, with countries eager to offer their native repertories. Interaction of this kind led to expanded sound worlds for composers, as well as an interest in faraway places and sounds, known as exoticism. Debussy's Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun was inspired by a symbolist poem by Mallarmé. The poem describes the faun, a half-man, half-goat creature symbolizing raw sensuality. Debussy's music was a series of backdrops illustrating the faun and his actions. The music is fluid and rhapsodic, with novel tone colors and chords. Debussy's work was later choreographed scandalously by Nijinsky. Claude Debussy was born near Paris and entered the Paris Conservatory at age 11. He openly defied the rules of his composition professors. His most productive decade was the 1890s, which culminated in his opera Pelléas and Mélisande, based on a symbolist drama. Debussy considered art to be a sensuous experience. Above all, it should give pleasure. His piano pieces demonstrate an interest in non-Western scales, heard at the 1889 Paris exhibition. Debussy also helped establish the mélodie as a national art form. Immigrants, including involuntary ones as slaves, have intersected since the United States' earliest decades. Sometimes racial and ethnic segregation was an obstacle. For others, it was a starting point for musical exchange. A Christian movement, known as the Second Great Awakening, swept the United States at the beginning of the 19th century. A feature of this was camp meetings, during which African Americans and Euro-Americans gathered to sing hymns of praise and ring shouts. Slaves also had their separate camp meetings, during which the tradition of the spiritual was developed both as a way of worship and as a subversive political endeavor. Just after the Civil War, the Fisk Jubilee Singers toured popularizing spirituals. Harry T. Burleigh and others began creating arrangements of spirituals for solo voice and piano. These were quickly adopted as concert staples in America alongside European art song. This trend overlapped with the ideals of the Harlem Renaissance. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was a song popularized by the Fisk Jubilee Singers, ironically introduced to them by a white man who first heard it at a Native American school. The song exists in many arrangements and reworkings. It is loosely based on a passage from the second book of Kings, in which the prophet Elijah is taken up to heaven. The spiritual is based on a pentatonic scale and contains much repetition. Musicians have long been putting bodies in motion, marching and dancing. Both rely on music to structure their regular patterns of movement. 19th century American vernacular music included music for brass bands. This had its beginnings in Revolutionary War regimental bands. The most prominent 18th century band was the U.S. Marine Band. During the Civil War, there were bands on both sides. After the war, these groups organized into concert and dance ensembles, the most notable under the leadership of Patrick S. Gilmore. John Philip Sousa conducted the U.S. Marine Band and then formed his own group. As a composer, he wrote over 130 marches for band, earning him the title the March King. Sousa's band toured extensively and benefited greatly not only from sheet music sales, but also from the mass marketing of recordings. It is often more practical to hire a piano player to accompany social dancing instead of a band. The last decades of the 1890s saw an African American style that modified Euro-American traditions through rhythmic and melodic variation. That style was called ragtime. Scott Joplin, the king of ragtime, was one of the first African Americans to gain widespread visibility as a composer. His rags combine balanced phrasing and key structures with highly syncopated melodies. Joplin's biggest hit was the Maple Leaf Rag. It features 4 16-measure strains, each repeated, and a syncopated melody against a steady accompaniment. Joplin recorded this piece on a piano roll, making it possible to recreate his performance on a player piano. Scott Joplin was born in Texarkana, Texas, to a musical family. He left home at age 14 and traveled around, playing in honky-tonks and piano bars. He performed ragtime at the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, helping the genre gain public notice. In 1899, his sheet music for Maple Leaf Rag sold 1 million copies, bringing him financial security. Joplin insisted on royalties rather than a flat payment for this and other ragtime pieces. It was Joplin's goal to elevate ragtime to a serious art form.